That's a humbling video. That was in 2005. Tom Brady, if you're not familiar with who he is, 17 years later, still playing football. And, it's not even really an argument anymore. Best quarterback, I think, to ever live. I mean, he's made almost every stat you can break, every record you can hold. He holds it. Retired for about a month or two, and then decided to come back to it. That was 2005, 17 years later. He's got 4 more Super Bowl rings, and he might still be searching. But I love his honesty, right? His raw ability to say, is this all it is? Like, there's got to be something more. And it's unique to think about that. And he asked, hey, what's your favorite? And I think it was either in this one or a different one, but he says, what's your favorite ring? And he says the next one, 4 ones later. And there's this chase of like saying, hey, I've got all this stuff. I'm still unsatisfied. Kind of the pinnacle reality of what we think life is. He's got it. And he goes, there's got to be something more. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, 7 Super Bowl rings, NFL MVP, supermodel wife, beautiful kids, crazy riches, all that stuff. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we are made for another world, right? There's something in us. If we're not satisfied, there's something in us that would show we can't be satisfied here because we're meant for another world. Now, we're studying the book of Ecclesiastes this morning, and there's 2 terms that you have to understand in order to really read this book and get all out of this book that we are intended to. The 2 phrases or 2 words are hevel, first one, and the second one is the phrase under the sun. So we'll look at those. So if you got your Bibles, Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, it starts off super encouraging. This is usually the K-Love verse of the day. It's Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2, and he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Maybe some of your translations say meaninglessness. All is meaninglessness. The Hebrew word there is hevel, H-E-V-E-L. So you can say hevel with me, 1, 2, 3, hevel, right? It's a really significant word. It's mentioned 38 times in this book, 38 times, okay, in this short 12 chapters. And its most literal meaning is smoke or vapor. So I got some matches that I didn't plan for. Anthony thankfully brought me some. But I just want to show what hevel is. So you've got this. Okay, see that? That's hevel. And it's just gone. It's just gone, right? That's hevel. That's what he means, okay? And so there's 3 aspects to what hevel is. 3 kind of legs that it stands on. Number 1 is just the unpredictable chance. So you saw the smoke. Maybe light it match again or something like that. But you can see it and it looked, oh, that's solid. And you try to grab it and then it evades you. There's no way you can actually lay hold of it. So there's this reality to hevel that there's this unpredictable chance. Anything could happen. It's just random. And then there's another aspect of hevel of limited time. So you see that's probably the easiest understandable thing about smoke is that it's just so temporary. You saw it and then it just evaporated into the air and it's gone. And that's the thing about life or hevel is that it's drawing out the temporariness of our lives. It's just fleeting. And then the last thing, so not only unpredictable chance or limited time, but also inevitable death, is that the smoke lasted just for a second, but also it's gone. There's we all are going to die. There's this inevitable reality to hevel in poking the proverbial balloons of our life and saying, you're going to die. You can't avoid that. That's hevel, right? Smoke. Everything is smoke or vapor. So that's the Hebrew word for vanity or meaninglessness. And then you get the word or the phrase under the sun. So then look at verse 3. He follows that encouraging verse with, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Under the sun. That's repeated 28 times in Ecclesiastes. So hevel 38 times, under the sun 28 times. Under the sun basically means what this world has to offer us. What these 80 years here and now have to give us or can offer us. And so there's 3 kind of things under the sun that the writer, and most likely this is written by Solomon. He was, it doesn't ever mention him, so it's clear to say, I don't think it changes the book, but Solomon was the son of King David. He was king. It says that he's the son of David. king over Jerusalem, and he lives a very Solomon life, so it makes sense. But anyways, Solomon writes in there, and he gives 3 experiments under the sun, 3 things under the sun that we can busy ourselves with. Accumulating wisdom, right, getting smarter, learning, experiencing pleasure, so just enjoying life and all those realities of it, and lastly is achieving work. Those are kind of the 3 realities of under the sun that we often do in order to find meaning. And so Ecclesiastes is explaining life under the sun, kicked out of the garden, cursed by sin. So if you're unfamiliar with the creation narrative in Genesis, in chapter 1 and 2, God creates the world, everything in it, right? All the trees, the animals, all of it, including Adam and Eve, the first 2 humans. And they have this amazing garden that they're in. They end up sinning, and God is gracious to them by not killing them, but he does kick them out of the garden. And out of the garden, life is now cursed. Life is now different, and Hevel enters the world because it's fractured of what was once perfect and beautiful. And so Ecclesiastes is basically explaining life east of Eden. Life kicked out of the garden. All the things we're subjected to because our lives are now cursed by sin. They're just different than what it was in the garden. And in a lot of ways, what he's saying with under the sun is let's just take a perspective of just within these 80 years. We're not looking above the sun. We're not looking in light of eternity. We're not looking in light of Jesus. We're just saying if we were just to squeeze the world dry of everything it has to offer, that's under the sun. So the key point to Ecclesiastes is that life is Hevel under the sun. Life is Hevel under the sun. If eternity isn't a reality, then our lives are a hopeless tragedy. All the aspects of our lives, wisdom, pleasure, work, friendships, family, food, all of them are meaningless without Jesus. And so, friends, the writer is exposing how we're so fixated on our temporary lives here that we forget eternity. And if we're being honest, like actually honest, most of us live like functional atheists, trying to squeeze everything out of this world and this life as if there isn't an infinitely better one to come. Gorging ourselves at the buffet of what this world has to offer, thinking it will satisfy when it's all just a mirage and Jesus is the only one that can satisfy. The things that we think are solid are smoke. The things we think are valuable are vanity. The things we think will give us meaning are meaningless. See, Ecclesiastes is kind of like a thief. He comes and he robs us of the fleeting joy that we have been getting from wisdom, pleasure, and work. But in turn, he restores to us God's intended joy through wisdom, pleasure, and work. So to be clear, this isn't bleak pessimism. This is a holy realism. It's honest. And so here's what Eugene Peterson said about Ecclesiastes. He said, Ecclesiastes isn't a meal, it's a bath. We need it to get scrubbed clean from illusion and idolatrous thoughts. It's a refreshing negation of the seductive suggestions swirling around us, promising everything but delivering nothing. Can we just admit we really need to understand this book? Like, this is really significant. To have our heads pushed upward to gaze on the beauty of Jesus in the glory of eternity rather than have our heads down focusing on the Hevel of our lives. We need our heads to be pushed up, and that's what Ecclesiastes does. So here's what we're going to do. I'll say this. I'm going to talk as fast as I can, there's a lot of content, but we're going to go through. We're only looking at the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes, by the way, but we're going to go through them quick, okay? In 2 different parts. First one is looking at wisdom, pleasure, and work under the sun. Wisdom, pleasure, and work as if eternity wasn't a reality, as if Jesus wasn't actually on his throne. Let's just look at what these 3 things really have to offer us to drink the world deep. And then we'll then switch after. It'll feel deflating, it'll feel defeating, it'll feel somber, but then we'll switch and see in the second part of the sermon, hey, what then does wisdom, pleasure, and work look like above the sun? What does it look like in light of Jesus and eternity? So first, accumulating wisdom under the sun. If you got your Bibles, Ecclesiastes 1, we're going to read verses 12 through 18. And his first experiment on wisdom. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that's done under heaven. It's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I've seen everything that's done under the sun, and behold, all is Hevel and striving after the wind. What's crooked cannot be made straight. What's lacking can't be counted. I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this is also but a striving after the wind. It's hevel. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So the question I want to ask in each of these three things is, what are we hoping that pleasure gives us? So just to be clear, the end goal is never wisdom. The end goal is never to get pleasure. The end goal is never to achieve work. Those are all a means to an end. So the question we're asking is, what means, or the wisdom is the means, but what's the end that we hope wisdom is producing? What are we hoping pursuing wisdom gives us? I'll propose three things. Number one, I think the biggest is control. When we pursue wisdom, when we pursue knowledge, when we pursue learning, most of us want a perceived sense of control. Because we think about this. If I can make the right decision and be smart enough to do that, the right decision will then obviously produce the right outcome. And so we do this with everything. We think about just how you got to your job. You think about school. You're in high school. You're studying hard. You're trying to get that ACT right or SAT. If I get that right score and I study hard, that'll secure either my scholarship so I can go to college or the right college that I want to go to. And so let me control my circumstance. Let me study really hard. Let me do it. Let me get wise, and then I can go to the right school. If I go to the right school and then I apply that same wisdom aspect, hard work to it, then I can get the right GPA. I can get into grad school or whatever, and then that will secure the right job, which then will secure the right lifestyle, which then will, all these things. And so we're looking at wisdom going, if I can make the right choices, I can produce it. We do it with love. Hey, I want to be married someday, and so let me study about relationships or interpersonal things or the right place to meet a person or how to develop in a relationship or how to pursue somebody or how to propose. And if I do that the right way, then I'll for sure get married. We do this with finances. Hey, if I just save this amount when I'm younger, then I'll be able to retire at this age and all this, and this will be great. We do it with health. If I just work out, eat right, whatever. We do it with parenting. This is convicting to me of thinking, if I learn how to disciple my kids really, really well, that will guarantee that they'll walk with Jesus, right? If I really know how to discipline them and how to point them to Jesus and what Bible study to do with them and how to pray, then I'll know that they'll have faithful lives following Jesus. We want control. We pursue wisdom for that. The second thing is that we pursue wisdom for is respect. I think that there's nothing more satisfying than someone coming to you and asking for your advice, right? There's something really just helpful about that. And thank you for coming to me. And we think man, if I'm smart enough, people will notice me. People will respect me. People will admire me. They'll want to invite me onto their board. They'll want to invite me into their life and hard decisions and whatever it may be. And so we just think let me get smart and then let me flex it so they come. And this is really pervasive in Christian communities. Let me quote the Bible verses I know, and so they know that I know a lot. Maybe they'll invite me up into leadership. Maybe they'll ask whatever it is, but we pursue wisdom for respect. And lastly, this is a little bit subtle, but peace. I think we pursue wisdom for peace. There's this thought of all of us have big questions in our minds. All of us have things we just can't answer. And we think, maybe if I study hard enough, whether it's the word and I can understand something about God, or whether it's just life or anatomy or psychology or whatever, health, I can explain why this happened or why this isn't happening yet. Or I can just get some sense of peace. If I could really explain it and understand it, then I would have peace about it, right? But then, remember, hevel, that needle comes in to poke hevel. Out of all of those things, there's time, a limited time, there's unpredictable chance, there's inevitable death, and goes, let me pop this bubble that we have on wisdom. And so the question is, why is accumulating wisdom then under the sun ultimately hevel? Well, Solomon explains. In one simple sentence, I think to explain, wisdom can feed our illusion of control, then hevel corrupts it, and we end up crumbling. That's kind of in one simple sentence. Wisdom feeds our illusion of control. So look at chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. This is his other mention of the experiment on wisdom. Chapter 2, 14 and 15. He says, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? Right? Why have I been so very wise? So what he says is he comes to reality. I've studied, I've thought, I've learned, and yet I'm going to die just like the person who hasn't learned anything. Just like the person who sat playing Xbox all day. What is going on? I've been in books. I got my PhD. They didn't do anything, and we're both going to end up dying. Not only are we going to die, but actually I might die sooner than them. And we know this happens all the time, right? It's like, doesn't matter how holy you are, how good you are, how healthy you are, you just can't control the reality that we inevitably die, and all of us have limited time. And some of that, we might be called home to heaven or to death earlier than other people. And there's this reality we're just coming to grips with going, hold on. They've done nothing. They haven't worked towards health. They haven't worked towards learning. And they might have a longer life than me. And I've done all this work, and I might die earlier. Like this, and it's not just death, it's anything. Hey, we love God. We've been learning about fertility, and we just can't get pregnant. Like, what's going on here? Like, and yet these other people who don't care about God or don't know, they're getting pregnant. Or this person, like, I'm studying on how to be a great wife, and I think it's going to be really great. But this other girl who doesn't care about anything, she's getting married. And what about this? Or this guy that is like super, he just doesn't have any integrity, and he gets all the raises, and he gets the promotions, and and there's this aspect where he's just going, wisdom is not producing my controlled outcome that I'm trying to make. And that's problematic. Then here's the other thing. Look at verse 18 in chapter 1. I've been sitting on this for a long time, this last couple weeks, but he says, for in much wisdom is much vexation. That's another word for being annoyed or frustrated. And he says, much wisdom, much vexation. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So he actually coordinates saying, hey, he correlates, if I gain in wisdom, I also gain in sorrow. The smarter I get, the sadder I get. And I'm wondering, why would that ever be a reality? It doesn't make any sense. But remember, we're looking under the sun. So what's happening is wisdom isn't doing what wisdom should be doing. And it's making frustration, and it's making sorrow. And he's sad because he's looking at life going, I learned what I should do, and I'm making the right decisions, but I'm not producing the right outcome. Therefore, I'm sad and I'm frustrated. And then you go, well, why? Well, then look up at verse 15 in chapter 1. He says, what's crooked can't be made straight, and what's lacking can't be counted. So again, this perceived illusion of control that we all live in because of wisdom. There's this reality where we come to grips with there's aspects of life that we can't change. And it eats at us because as we've grown in wisdom, we're so frustrated that we know the right answer, but we can't implement it. We know the right way and the advice, but we can't change that person. And it produces sorrow and frustration, and we just get mad. One author said that the best word for hevel in American language is paradox. Like there's this random chance to life, and wisdom hates a paradox because it doesn't fit in our logic, and it frustrates us. So that's wisdom. Okay, next, pleasure. Let's look at his second experiment. Wisdom didn't work. Okay, maybe pleasure will. Chapter 2, we'll look at three things. So this is kind of asking, what can I get out of life? So chapter 2 is where it starts. And let's ask the question, what do we think experiencing pleasure will give us? The first one is satisfaction. First thing is satisfaction. Look at verse 1 in chapter 2. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. That phrase, enjoy yourself. That's a call or a plea or a aim toward satisfaction. And so hedonism is a significant term. It essentially just means the pursuit of pleasure. Like, hey, we're in a lot of, probably all of us are hedonists in some regard. John Piper argues for Christian hedonism, which basically believes God is most glorified in us when we're most satisfied in him, when we find our pleasure in him. But for most of us, we operate as secular hedonists, right? Where we're just looking for pleasure or for joy. So you wonder, why are you getting married? Well, I think getting married is going to make me happy. Well, why are you accepting that job versus the other job, but it has higher pay? Well, I think higher pay is going to make me happier because I can do that. Okay, great. Well, why are you pursuing this? Well, I just think it's going to make me happier. There's this reality where we're just pursuing enjoying ourselves, which to be clear, I'm not like poking a hole in hedonism necessarily, but there's a reality that all of us are motivated by this satisfaction goal to try to get to it. We're trying to motivate it on how do I enjoy myself. And really, satisfaction is really fueled by the phrase, if I had a little bit more. So I think I'd really enjoy myself if I had a little bit nicer spouse, if I had a little bit bigger house, if I had a better backyard, if I had a better paying job, if I had more vacation time. I would really be able to enjoy myself if I had a little bit more. We pursue pleasure to get satisfaction. The second thing is in verse 10. So look at verse 10 in chapter 2. He says, whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Kept my heart from no pleasure. The second one we pursue pleasure for is indulgence. This is kind of a unique word, so let me nuance it a little bit. But this is basically the idea of a bucket list in life. 90 years or 80 years, however many times we get here on earth, and we live with a bucket list. I want to get everything out of life. I don't want to miss out on anything life has to offer. I want to go overseas and see those places. I want to get married. I want to have kids. I want to retire. I want to get the home in Arizona. I want to do this. I want to see that. I want to eat this. I want to be friends with it. Whatever it is. But there's this reality that's kind of innate in us that wants to squeeze everything out of life that it has to offer. I think we're really plagued at coming to the end of our lives and not looking back and going, I didn't get to experience this. Right? That's why we live in a bucket list culture where it's like, I want to go see Greece someday, or I want to go see the beaches of Thailand, or I want to eat at this really fancy restaurant. There's this reality where we want to squeeze everything out of the life that it has to offer. We want to be indulgent because of our pleasure. And number 3, at the end of verse 10, he says, this was my reward for all my toil. The other reason we pursue pleasure is for relief. So when you're stressed, what do? When you're just overwhelmed, stressed, what do? For me, I open up a little thing called Amazon, and I just scroll, and I just look through, and I think I need that, and I get it. I need a new pair of shoes. I need this random gadget. Or I open up Facebook Marketplace, and I'm meeting with Randy down south, and I'm just like, hey, can I buy this from you? He said, yeah, it sounds great. But there's something in us that is looking at pleasure or buying something as a temporary relief to what we're struggling with. Or let's say this too. You're overwhelmed. You're tired. It's a season that's discouraging. It's disappointing. It's hard. Whatever. Maybe it's tragedy. What are you thinking about? Vacation. Oh, I can't wait till the weekend. I can't wait till vacation. I just need to plan something, and I need to get away, right? Pleasure producing relief. Enjoy pleasure, escape pain. We do it all the time. Those are reasons that we pursue pleasure. Okay, so then why is experiencing pleasure ultimately hevel under the sun? Well, I want you to look at Solomon's encompassing list of achievements in verses 4 through 8. In chapter 2. He says, I made great works. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delights of the sons of man. And so what he's saying in here is basically, I've experienced everything. I've got properties, I've got parties, I've got people, I've got vineyards, which means I've got great wine, I've got herds, which means I have great food, I've got pools, which means I've got recreation, and all that. I mean, he just goes on. I've got concubines, which means the sexual pleasures, all these things. I've got all of them. And he went through all of it, and it's going, okay, great. But I want you to notice, this is really significant. Verses 5 and 6 says he has pools to irrigate the gardens and parks. So get backyard pool with a diving board out of your mind. That's not it. Think rivers. Like he created new rivers. And what's wild is in verse 5, the phrase all kinds of fruit trees is the same Hebrew phrase used 3 times in the creation narrative for when God was making the Garden of Eden. So don't miss this. He was trying to get back to paradise. He was literally trying to recreate the Garden of Eden through this. But you can't under the sun, and you definitely can't by yourself. And so look at his conclusion to all his toil and trying to recreate the garden in paradise. Verse 11, and then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all is hevel and striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. In other words, I checked everything off the bucket list. He got to this point where he said, there's no experience, there's no pleasure, there's no place that anyone could bring me to that I haven't already experienced it. I've checked it all off. I've indulged completely. I've been satisfied by every satisfactory pleasure that possible. I've been relieved of pain and all this stuff. I have servants to help me on all this stuff. And he goes, there's nothing to be gained. It's all vanity. So listen, you can drink the world dry and still be thirsty. Like that's what he's explaining with pleasure. You can drink the world dry and still be thirsty. You can get the pleasure to temporarily satisfy, check off every bucket list item, and pursue relief to forget the pain and stress, but you'll still be unsatisfied. And he says this phrase, striving after the wind, over and over. That's the other main phrase in this book. So picture we look outside and we're like, oh yeah, there's Timmy. And Timmy's got like a net and he's just jumping in the wind with the net trying to and we're like, what are you doing? He's like trying to catch it. And we're like, somebody please call the cops. Like, this is not a good spot right now. But this is what we function in every day of our lives in trying to pursue satisfaction in this world where we have a net out in the wind and we're trying to catch it and there's no way you're going to catch it. That's pleasure. Lastly, work, achieving work under the sun. What can I accomplish? And so what do we think achieving work will give us? Look at chapter 4. This is the only time we're going, or one of the only times we're going over here. Chapter 4, verse 4. This is really significant. He says, then I saw all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. Everything we do, all the work, all the toil, what's it come from? Envying our neighbor. It's basically like this. We live life, we're doing great. We look over and we go, oh my gosh, I want what they have. I love the relationship that they have, whatever. And so we look across the street, we look across the cubicle, we look on Facebook or Instagram, and we go, I want what they have. And so we work, and we work hard, and we try to get what they had. But I'd say the first thing that we want work to give us, the means to the end, what's the end, is actually to be envied. See, I think it's circular. I don't think we're okay with just getting as good of grill as our neighbor or as nice a yard or as good a paying job or as nice to vacations or whatever. I think we look around and we see what other people have, and we not only want to have that, we actually want to have something that they want. We actually want to be envied where they're going, I want to live the life that you live. I want to travel like you travel. I want to work the flexible hours like you work. I want to have the relationship. I want to have the obedient kids like you have. And we look around and we want all the things that they have. And then we want, in turn, for them to want what we have. We want to be envied because we work. We want to get to a place where people go, I want to get where you're at. Number two, what do we think achieving work will give us? Rest. Rest. This is big. This is probably specifically pointed to some of the maybe older generation in the room, and you've experienced this too, but I think we work to rest. If I work hard enough, I'll be able to rest. If I work really, really hard early on in life or even through my middle age or whatever, then I can retire at this right space and I can retire comfortably, and I know I'm working hard and I know I'm tired, but someday I'll get to rest. If I work really hard now, I will get to rest back then. I don't have to work until in my 70s or whatever, but I'll get to do a little bit early. And we just think if I work hard enough, rest is gonna come. I'm gonna work hard for the weekend and then replenish and go back and empty myself through the week. And the third thing I think achieving work will give us is identity. This is pervasive, and I'll speak maybe to the younger people and maybe try to call up older people too that have been sitting in this identity. But if I'm successful at work, I'll finally know who I really am. Right? And if you talk to anybody, one of the most common conversations we have is what you do for work. And it feels like we attach to what we do. And especially when we're successful in it. I am an engineer. I am a teacher. I am a dentist or whatever it may be. But there's something about our work that gives us meaning and purpose and identity. And we go, this is my unique contribution in the world. This is my legacy that I'm leaving behind, right? So then the question, well, let's poke a hole in it. Or what's the hevel about it? In one phrase, we anxiously work for a vulnerable kingdom under the sun. We anxiously work for a vulnerable kingdom under the sun. So look at chapter 2, verse 23. So the end of chapter 2, verse 23. He says, this is his experiment, 18 through 23 on work. And he says, for all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is vexation. Now remember, those two words were used for wisdom, right? Remember? It's producing much vexation, and more knowledge equals more sorrow. So the first thing he says is, I'm working now on the third experiment. I tried wisdom, didn't work. I tried pleasure, didn't work. Then I tried work, and it's not working. And I'm going to this, and I'm full of sorrow, and my work is vexation. It's frustrating. It's hard. I'm sad. Why? Because work isn't working. Work isn't working. Hold on. I thought that if I worked really, really hard, I could be envied. But maybe some people envy me, but I still envy other people. I thought if I worked really, really hard, I could rest, but I'm just tired. I thought if I worked really hard that I could have identity and know who I am, but I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. And he's going, work isn't working. And I'm sad about it, and I'm confused about it, and I'm frustrated about it. What do I do? And what's weird is what we do when an idol doesn't give or deliver on its promise. We don't leave it and go to something else. We double down on it. So it's like work's not giving what I want it to give me. I maybe just probably need to work harder. And it's like, then you're putting 80 hours in and you're like, what are you doing? And then you're still sad and you're still frustrated and you're still confused and this whole thing, right, it's not working. And then he ends verse 23 with saying, even in the night, his heart doesn't rest. This is all hevel. He says, your 9 to 5 isn't producing what you thought it was, so now it's implicating 2 a.m. And you're up at night and you're confused and you're distracted and you're thinking and all this other stuff. And he's going, it's just, what's going on? And then look at verse 18 through 19. That's the anxiously work piece. This is the vulnerable kingdom. Verse 18, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it. Now, I must leave it. Those 4 words, circle them, underline them. We need to understand those. We need this to like actually sink into our heart. You will have to leave everything you work for. The house that you put blood, sweat, and tears in, you're going to have to leave it someday. The retirement account, whatever it is, you're going to have to leave it someday. The work, the empire, the dynasty, the kingdom, whatever it is, you're going to have to leave it someday. The classic line of, hey, when you're going to your funeral, like you're in a hearse, not a U-Haul. Like you just can't take any of it with you. And so you just have to realize that I can't keep it, right? I'm going to have to all let it go. And the second thing is if you look in verse 18, he says, I have to leave it to somebody else, and who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool. So it's vulnerable. Your work or whatever you're working for in the vulnerable kingdom it's vulnerable because you don't know. There's so many people that die right before retirement, the day they've been working for, or they die a couple years into retirement, or they die, they give an inheritance, and their generations just squander it, or they fight over it, and then there's division in the family, and it's like, man, all of it, it's just, you just don't know what's going to happen. Everything you work for, you have no guarantees about it. That's work, that's pleasure, that's wisdom under the sun. Pretty encouraging, right? So what do we do? What do we do with life? Do we just kind of throw up our hands with a permanent frown and depressed hearts and hold up signs that just say everything is hevel, right? Life is hevel. Is that our response? Or do we just evade ourselves from any sense of new wisdom or any sense of pleasure or any sense of work? I don't think that's the answer. In fact, look at the last verses in Ecclesiastes 12, 13 through 14. He says this, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Chapter 12, 13, and 14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So fear God, keep his commandments. In other words, look above the sun. Look above the sun, not under it. There's an eternal, glorious king sitting on his throne right now, and fearing him means to orient your life around him, to honor him, to love him, to know him, to enjoy him. And he says, for God will bring every deed into judgment. This is speaking to eternity, that there'll be a real moment of eternal judgment when our life on earth ends and our eternal destination is decided based on our fearing of God or our relationship with him. Ecclesiastes is calling us to look above the sun, not under it. To get out of the 80 years that we get here wandering on earth to the 80 billion years we get worshiping in glory. I think Colossians 3 in the New Testament perfectly summarizes this. Here's what Colossians 3 says, 1 through 4. If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth or under the sun. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also appear with him in glory. Listen, God isn't asking us to reject new wisdom, starve ourselves of good pleasure, and sit lazily refusing to work. Wisdom, pleasure, and work are beautiful gifts of God, but they've got to be seen in the right way to be enjoyed rightly. So one way to think of it is under the sun, wisdom, pleasure, and work are wrecked and cursed, but above the sun, wisdom, pleasure, and work are redeemed and cured. So I just want to run through quickly wisdom, pleasure, and work above the sun with a perspective of eternity in Jesus. So really quick, wisdom, 2 things. The foolish gospel. Within wisdom above the sun is the foolish gospel. Go and read 1 Corinthians 1. It's amazing. There's so much about it. But in verse 18 in 1 Corinthians 1, he says that the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. And just think about this. The gospel is stupid. Like there's a reality where it just is so illogical. It's so contrary to wisdom. Think about the American dream. If you work hard enough, you can get anything you want. You can get there. You can achieve it. Okay, great. What's the gospel say? You can't. You can't get there. You can't earn it. There's nothing you could do to impress God, get his attention, spark his interest. In fact, you're so dead and broken that the only way you could be saved is by God going into your brokenness. The gospel says you could do nothing to earn it. You were dead in your sin, and God came in his infinite grace to save you. You're simply a recipient. And the rest of the world goes, that's way too simple. That doesn't make any sense compared to our logic. And so we believe in wisdom above the sun. It's foolishness. It's just a foolish gospel, and yet it's true, and it's beautiful, and it's, like we said, it's a too good to be true gospel. The second thing with wisdom above the sun is trusting God, learning how to trust God. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, God says, my ways aren't your ways. My thoughts aren't your thoughts. And he says, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher. They're above. And so in wisdom above the sun, there's a humble reality in us that looks at the hevel of life and goes, God, you see from a higher perspective than I do. I've got a couple pieces of the puzzle. I've got a little bit of perspective, but I'm not seeing from your line of sight. I'm not seeing from your perspective. So wisdom above the sun goes, I'm not going to have answers to everything. I'm not going to know why this happened, but I'm going to trust Romans 8:28 that you're actually working it for good, and Genesis 50:20 that you can take what's evil and use it for my good and your glory. And there's a reality that Christians just trust God. In this foolish gospel that he's given us, we trust God to know he's doing something that we can't explain or understand. The second thing is pleasures above the sun. Two things. Number one, let pleasure point to Jesus. Let pleasure point to Jesus. If you look at Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, verse 24, he says, after his experiments on work and wisdom and pleasure, he says, verse 24 in Chapter 2, there's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw, this is key, is from the hand of God. He's looking at drink and eat and pleasure and joy, and he's going, that's from your hand, God. That's from above. James 1:17 says, every good and perfect gift comes from above. So listen, when you're standing at the altar and you're getting married to your dream spouse, that's from Jesus. And go, oh God, thank you. When you are sitting in your backyard after getting it freshly landscaped and it's beautiful and it's a great sanctuary, or you walk into your new house, God, thank you. This is from you. This is from your hand. When you eat that amazing meal and you take that bite just to internalize a second, this pleasure, this enjoyment is pointing to you, Jesus. When you get to go on a date night with your spouse or be intimate, God, this is from you. This is amazing. There's this reality where we're looking at life and all the pleasures and going, we're not supposed to be starved from them. We're actually supposed to experience them and look upward and go, God, thank you for this gift. This is amazing. I can't believe you've given me it. So we're not supposed to feel guilty about those good pleasures God has given. We're actually supposed to experience them and look upward and know they're from his hand. And number two for pleasure is anticipating eternity. Anticipating eternity above the sun. See, listen, pleasures here will seem stale and rotten compared to the pleasures in eternity. 2 Peter 3:13 says that according to this promise, we're waiting for new heavens and new earth. Revelation 21, just go and read it, the first 7 verses. It's talking about what the new heavens and the earth will be like. And he says, they're going to be new. So it doesn't matter how great the Greece is going to be or how awesome it'll be to see the Eiffel Tower or the beaches of Thailand or South Africa, whatever it is. All of those places will look like the slums of Tijuana compared to what they'll be like in eternity. Whatever meal you could experience, whatever relational satisfaction you could experiment, all of it will be stale and rotten compared to experiencing that in the new heavens and the earth. Anticipate that day. Look to that day where all tears will be wiped away. Death will be no more. God will be with his people. The thirsty will get to drink for free. I mean, experience and anticipate that day. Pleasure above the sun. And lastly, work above the sun. This is big, but 2 things is one, enjoying rest. Learning how to enjoy rest. Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus says, if you're tired, if you're weary, come to me and I'll give you rest. I won't lay anything heavy on you. So the Christian life should be marked by a lightness and an ease because Jesus is carrying the burdens that we're so often carrying. He says, enjoy this rest I've purchased you. Hebrews 4:10 says that the Christian gets to rest from his works because God rested from his. Or in some ways, because God worked, we get to rest from our works. And so if there's anything in you, for any Christian in the room, or like Skylar mentioned earlier, where you're thinking, man, I've got to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, and I'm working, and I'm reading every day, and I'm going to church because you think you can impress God, and you're working for that. Even on that sense, he's saying, you get to rest from your works. It's finished. It's done. You have a righteousness that's outside of you. So enjoying rest. And the second thing is looking to an eternal impact. Above the sun, work, we get to think about an eternal impact. I'm pleading with you, don't waste your life. Like, make your work last forever. And listen, that doesn't mean you work for the church. Doesn't mean you go to seminary. What it means is you see your job as a holy call from God. You look at wherever you work, whatever it is, as a kingdom post that God has placed you in intentionally. So the people across your desk or in your office space, the people you live across, the people you live with, your friends and family, they're all in need of a redeeming picture of who Jesus is in the gospel presented through word and through deed. And so to see that your work matters. Colossians 3:23 says, work for the Lord, not for man. And if you look at, it's like, think about working going, Revelation 7:9 says, the picture's heaven. There'll be every tribe, every tongue, every nation, all of it gathered in heaven. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be amazing. And to think, what if you were in heaven and you looked around and you saw a person, even if it was one person, that you impacted toward Christ, and they were here because God had used you to get them there. Remember, work, I must leave it. That really sucks about my job. Whatever I'm building is I'm going to have to leave it. You know what you won't have to leave is eternal impact in people's lives. What if your life was counted for that? What if you got to see people from other tribes and tongues and nations worshiping Jesus, and you went, I gave to that. I prayed for that. I went after that. Invest eternally. Matthew 6:20 says, don't give where moth and rust destroy, but invest in eternal things, where nothing can be destroyed. It's not vulnerable. It's secured. Invest into eternal things. C.T. Studd said this, only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. So yes, Ecclesiastes robs us of the fleeting joy that we have been getting from wisdom, pleasure, and work, but it restores to us God's intended joy through wisdom, pleasure, and work. Here's what Daniel Aiken said as we're finishing. He says, Solomon's life in so many ways reminds us of the prodigal son in Luke 15. So many think the prodigal son's sin was partying too much. And then he came to his senses and wanted to leave his party days behind. But we so often forget the story doesn't just begin with a party, it ends with a party. Yes, there's a party in the far country that leaves the son broken, but there's also an epic party when he gets back home. Dancing and singing can be heard from outside. The difference is the son can't enjoy the party rightly until he's satisfied in the Father's love. So, under the sun, kicked from the garden, our lives are a sad reminder of what God intended for us. A continual reminder of what we're missing out on and what we could have had despite our sin. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had true wisdom. They got to learn from God and walk with God and hear him and learn from him. They had pinnacle pleasures. They were naked and unashamed. They had every lush fruit imaginable and a perfect, unhindered creation fresh from the fingertips of God. They had meaningful work to tend the garden, name the animals, be fruitful and multiply. And then they sin, and it's all tainted. Hevel, everything is hevel. Wisdom, pleasure, and work are now uniquely cursed under the sun. And we busy ourselves pursuing them, hoping to get back to the garden. But the difference between that garden and today isn't work, pleasure, and joy. It's God. It's the presence of God with us. And the good news of the gospel is that the Son of God came down under the sun. Jesus Christ engaged in the hevel of our lives. He kicked us out of the garden, but he came back for us, and he's coming back for us. And he died definitively to say, your life is not meaningless. It means so much that the eternal God of the universe stepped under the sun and died for you to rescue into eternity. Your work isn't meaningless. Your wisdom isn't meaningless. Your pleasures aren't meaningless. They can all point to him above the sun. This is the beauty of the gospel that's free by grace to all who would believe. Amen. Let's pray.